It was a quiet evening on a long, empty stretch of highway. The sun had just set, casting a dull orange glow across the horizon. Marcus Johnson, an undercover FBI agent, sat in his black sedan, parked on the side of the road. He was calm, despite the long day of dealing with sensitive investigations into local police corruption. His mind wandered between the case and his desire to just get home, where a moment of peace awaited him. His phone buzzed, bringing him back to the present. He glanced at the screen. It was a message from his FBI contact, reminding him to stay alert. The case he was working on was volatile, and those involved wouldn't hesitate to take him down if they discovered who he really was. He exhaled slowly, nodding to himself. He'd been trained for situations like this, but every day felt like walking a tightrope, especially when working so closely with law enforcement. Just as Marcus began to relax, the flash of red and blue lights appeared in his rearview mirror. The sight didn't surprise him. Being a black man driving a nice car in this part of town often brought unwanted attention. He'd been through this drill too many times to count. He watched in the mirror as the police car slowly approached, pulling up behind him. The headlights glared in his rearview mirror, the lights spinning rhythmically, casting strange shadows across the empty road. The officer stepped out of his cruiser, his silhouette framed by the flashing lights. Officer Brad Thompson, a man in his early 40s, walked with authority, his posture tense. Marcus could already feel the weight of the situation. Brad's hand rested near his holster, an action that screamed of ingrained suspicion and a long history of racial profiling. Marcus took a deep breath, knowing what was coming. He lowered his window and waited. "License and registration," Brad demanded, his voice stern and brimming with unearned authority. His eyes swept over Marcus with thinly veiled disdain. There was no friendliness in his approach, just cold suspicion. Marcus nodded, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. He reached into the glove compartment and retrieved his documents, all while feeling the officer's eyes boring into him. Brad grabbed the documents, glancing at them briefly before looking back at Marcus. "What are you doing out here?" Brad's tone was more of an accusation than a question. His grip on the flashlight tightened as he leaned in closer. "I'm on my way home from work," Marcus replied evenly, his face impassive. He had long learned to keep his emotions in check during moments like this. Any slip could escalate the situation. Brad raised an eyebrow, not convinced. "Where's work?" he asked, his voice laced with skepticism. The tension between them was palpable, hanging heavy in the air. "I work for the government," Marcus answered simply, knowing that revealing too much too soon might complicate things. He wasn't about to disclose his role as an FBI agent, not yet. Brad scoffed, shaking his head as if the answer was a joke. "You don't look like someone who works for the government," he sneered, his words dripping with prejudice. He stared at Marcus, waiting for him to trip up or say something wrong. Marcus's jaw tightened, but he held his ground. He'd seen this before. Officers using every excuse to justify their biases, digging for anything that could incriminate a black man in a car they deemed too nice for him to drive. "Is there a problem with my documents, officer?" Marcus asked calmly, though his patience was wearing thin. He could feel the familiar burn of frustration rising, but he knew better than to let it show. Brad stared at him, not responding right away. There was a moment of silence, the only sound being the distant hum of the wind. Finally, Brad spoke again, his voice lower and more threatening. "Why don't you step out of the vehicle?" Marcus's heart rate quickened, but his face remained neutral. This was going south fast. He'd been in this situation before, pulled over for no reason, asked to step out of his car without cause. But this time, he wasn't just a civilian. He was an FBI agent, and the stakes were higher than ever. "Officer," Marcus began carefully, "I don't think that's necessary. I've complied with everything you've asked. What exactly is the issue here?" Brad's eyes narrowed, his hand drifting closer to his weapon. "You're asking too many questions," he muttered, his voice dark. "I said step out." Marcus knew this moment could escalate quickly. He took a deep breath, weighing his options. He didn't want to blow his cover, but he also wasn't going to let himself be bullied into submission. Slowly, he opened the car door and stepped out, standing tall in front of Brad. The two men locked eyes, the tension between them thickening with every passing second. Brad's grip tightened around his flashlight, his knuckles white. "Turn around," he ordered, but there was something in his voice, something that hinted at more than just standard procedure. There was a personal edge to his command, a subtle indication that this was about more than protocol. It was about power. Marcus didn't move. He stood his ground, staring directly at Brad. "Officer," he said calmly, "you don't want to do this." Brad blinked, taken aback for a moment by the directness in Marcus's voice. The balance of power shifted ever so slightly, and for the first time Brad looked unsure of himself. But the doubt quickly vanished, replaced by stubborn pride. "You don't get to tell me what I want to do," Brad snapped. "Turn around now." Marcus remained still, the weight of the situation pressing on him. This was more than just another traffic stop. He could feel it. And as Brad's hand hovered dangerously close to his holster, Marcus knew that this moment, this encounter, could change everything. The air between them was thick with tension as Marcus stood his ground, his body still, and his eyes locked on Brad. For a moment, it felt like time had slowed, the world reduced to this small, intense pocket of space on the side of an empty road. The flashing lights from Brad's patrol car cast a harsh, almost surreal glow on the scene, illuminating the officer's face, twisted with anger and suspicion. "Turn around," Brad repeated, his voice sharp and unrelenting, but there was something behind his eyes now, a flicker of doubt, perhaps uncertainty. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone he had already decided was beneath him. Marcus knew this type of man well. He had encountered them his whole life, men who wore their authority like a weapon, ready to swing it at anyone who dared defy them. But Marcus wasn't just anyone, and he certainly wasn't going to be another black man treated unjustly without reason. "Officer, I think we're getting off on the wrong foot here," Marcus said, keeping his tone measured and calm, though inside he could feel the frustration boiling. "I've complied with everything you've asked. There's no reason to escalate this." Brad's jaw clenched. His hand twitched near his holster, the threat of violence lingering just below the surface. He was clearly on edge, his power being challenged by someone he didn't expect to push back. But Marcus wasn't playing into his game. He wasn't going to give Brad any excuse to make this situation worse. "You don't tell me how to do my job," Brad growled, stepping closer, his breath heavy with the scent of coffee and stress. "I said turn around." Marcus met his gaze evenly, refusing to back down. He had dealt with worse situations, more dangerous people, but something about this encounter felt raw. This was personal for Brad, and Marcus could sense the weight of his prejudice pressing down on the moment. Before Marcus could respond, his phone buzzed again in his pocket, his FBI contact. He knew he shouldn't ignore it, but now wasn't the time to answer. Still, the vibration was a reminder that this situation had layers. Brad wasn't just an angry cop on a power trip. There was a deeper, more dangerous undercurrent here, one that Marcus had been investigating for months. Brad noticed the distraction, his eyes narrowing. "You think this is funny?" he barked. "You think you're better than me?" Marcus's face remained calm, though inside his patience was thinning. "No, officer. I'm simply trying to get home. There's no need for this to go any further." But Brad wasn't hearing it. His hand moved to his holster, resting on the grip of his gun as if daring Marcus to make the wrong move. The hostility was thick now, almost tangible, and Marcus knew that if he didn't play this right, things could spiral out of control. "I don't like your attitude," Brad muttered, his voice low and dangerous. "Men like you think you can just walk around, do whatever you want, and get away with it." There it was, the raw, unfiltered prejudice slipping out through the cracks in Brad's composure. Marcus felt a surge of anger rise within him, but he held it back. He knew better than to let his emotions get the best of him, especially in a situation like this. "You don't know anything about me," Marcus said, his voice steady but firm. "But I'm telling you right now, officer, you're making a mistake." Brad smirked, his fingers twitching on the handle of his gun. "A mistake? No, the only mistake here is you thinking you can tell me how to do my job." Marcus took a deep breath, his mind racing through his options. He didn't want to reveal his FBI status just yet. It would complicate things. But Brad was pushing, And if Marcus didn't defuse the situation soon, he knew things could get ugly. "I'm not here to argue with you, officer," Marcus said, trying to keep his voice calm despite the storm brewing inside him. "But you're profiling me, and we both know it. There's no reason for this stop to go any further." Brad's smirk faded, replaced by a scowl. His hand tightened around the grip of his gun. "You think you're smarter than me? You think you can just talk your way out of this?" Marcus could feel the tension in the air reach a breaking point. He had been in dangerous situations before, but this was different. This wasn't about criminal operations or undercover work. This was about a man with power, lashing out because he felt threatened. "I'm trying to help you, officer," Marcus said quietly, his voice now tinged with a sense of urgency. "But if you continue down this road, it's not going to end well for either of us." Brad's face twisted with anger. He stepped closer, the tension between them electric. "You don't get to decide how this ends," Brad spat, his voice seething with resentment. "I do." Marcus's phone buzzed again, and this time he couldn't ignore it. He needed to take control of the situation now. Slowly, deliberately, he reached for his phone, holding it up where Brad could see. "Officer, I'm an FBI agent," Marcus said, his voice firm but calm. "I've been undercover for months, working on a case involving corrupt officers in this district. If you take a minute to check my credentials, you'll see I'm telling the truth." For a moment, Brad froze, his face a mixture of shock and disbelief. The revelation hit him hard, the realization slowly sinking in. But instead of backing down, Brad's grip on his gun tightened, his face contorting with rage. "You expect me to believe that?" Brad hissed, his voice trembling with anger. "You think I'm just going to take your word for it?" Marcus held his ground, refusing to back down. He knew that this was the moment, the tipping point. How Brad responded next would determine everything. "I can prove it," Marcus said evenly. "But I'm warning you, officer, this is bigger than you think. You're about to make a decision that could change your life." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and charged with meaning. Brad's face was flushed with anger, his eyes darting between Marcus and his patrol car as if weighing his options. Marcus remained still, his eyes locked on Brad, waiting. The moment felt like it stretched on forever, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. And then finally, Brad spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Show me!" The tension between Marcus and Brad was suffocating, as the air grew thick with unspoken hostility. Marcus remained calm, though his heart raced in his chest. He knew that the situation had reached a critical point, and that one wrong move could lead to a disaster. Brad's hand still hovered over his gun, his jaw clenched tightly. The realization that Marcus could be telling the truth about being an FBI agent clashed violently with the anger and power he felt in the moment. He wasn't ready to believe it, but something in Marcus's tone made him hesitate. "Show me your credentials," Brad demanded again, his voice shaking slightly. He took a step back, his eyes never leaving Marcus's, still unsure of what to make of the situation. Marcus moved slowly, keeping his hands visible, not wanting to escalate things further. His phone buzzed again in his pocket, but he ignored it for now. This was the moment he had to take control, and he couldn't afford to make a mistake. "Officer, I'm reaching into my glove compartment," Marcus said evenly, his voice steady but firm. "My badge and identification are inside. I'm going to show them to you." Brad said nothing, just nodded stiffly, his eyes still filled with suspicion. The flashing lights from his patrol car continued to flicker across the deserted road, adding a surreal glow to the confrontation. Marcus slowly opened the glove compartment, pulling out his FBI badge and holding it up for Brad to see. The tension hung in the air as Brad's eyes darted to the badge, then back to Marcus's face. He squinted, taking in the badge with a mixture of confusion and disbelief. For a moment, Brad didn't move. His mind seemed to race, trying to process the information. But Marcus could see it in his face. The wall of prejudice and power that Brad had built up over years wasn't coming down easily. "That could be fake," Brad muttered, his voice still laced with anger. He took another step back, his hand still on his gun. "I don't know who you think you are, but you're not fooling me." Marcus sighed inwardly, realizing that Brad wasn't going to accept the truth so easily. He had been dealing with men like Brad his entire career, officers who couldn't separate their power from their biases, who saw every black man as a threat until proven otherwise. "Officer," Marcus began, keeping his voice calm despite the frustration building inside him, "I understand this is a lot to take in, but I'm telling you the truth. I've been investigating corruption within this department for months. The officers involved are dangerous, and you're standing on the wrong side of this." Brad's eyes widened slightly, and for the first time there was a flicker of doubt in his expression. His grip on his gun loosened just a little, but his face remained hard. He wasn't ready to back down, not yet. "Corruption?" Brad repeated, his voice filled with suspicion. "What are you talking about? I don't know anything about that." Marcus could see the cracks forming in Brad's defenses, but he wasn't done yet. The deeper Marcus pushed, the more dangerous this situation could become. He had to handle this carefully. "I've been undercover, looking into officers who have been planting evidence, taking bribes, and covering up crimes," Marcus explained, his voice steady and authoritative. "You might not be involved, but the people you work with are, and if you don't want to go down with them, you need to think about what you're doing right now." Brad's face paled slightly, and Marcus could see the gears turning in his head. There was confusion there, yes, but also a growing realization that Marcus wasn't bluffing. The weight of the situation was beginning to sink in, and Brad's tough exterior was slowly crumbling. But even as the doubt crept into Brad's mind, he wasn't ready to give up control. He took a step forward, his face flushed with anger. "You think you can just come in here and tell me how to do my job?" Brad snapped, his voice trembling. "You think you're better than me?" Marcus remained calm, though his patience was wearing thin. "This isn't about being better than you," he replied evenly. "This is about doing the right thing. You need to step back, and we can figure this out." Brad's hand moved away from his gun, but his eyes were still hard. He was wrestling with the truth, fighting against everything he had been taught, everything he believed. Marcus could see the internal struggle playing out on Brad's face, but he wasn't sure which side would win. Just as the tension seemed to reach a breaking point, Marcus's phone buzzed again. This time, he glanced at it quickly, and his stomach dropped. It was a message from his FBI contact. "Watch your back. We have reason to believe Thompson might be involved." The words hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. Brad, the very officer standing in front of him, might be part of the corruption he had been investigating. The realization sent a chill down his spine, but he kept his face calm, not wanting to show any signs of alarm. He had to play this carefully. If Brad was involved, then this situation had just become far more dangerous than Marcus had anticipated. But he couldn't let on that he knew. Not yet. "Officer Thompson," Marcus said, his voice low and steady, "I need you to think very carefully about what happens next. I don't want this to go any further than it has to, but you need to make the right choice." Brad stared at him, his face unreadable, but Marcus could see the fear creeping into his eyes. Fear of being exposed, of losing control. For a moment, it looked like Brad might back down, that he might realize the gravity of the situation. But then, without warning, Brad's face hardened again, and his hand moved back to his gun. "You don't get to tell me what to do," he hissed, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. "You're the one who's in trouble here." Marcus felt his heart rate quicken, but he kept his expression calm. He knew that this was it, the moment where everything could go terribly wrong. Before he could respond, another pair of headlights appeared in the distance, illuminating the dark road ahead. Marcus's eyes flicked to the approaching vehicle, and he felt a surge of hope. His backup had arrived. Brad noticed the car as well, and for the first time there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. The approaching vehicle pulled up beside them, and a man in plain clothes stepped out. Marcus recognized him immediately, his FBI colleague, Agent Carter. Carter's presence shifted the dynamic in an instant. He walked up to the scene, his face serious but calm, and nodded at Marcus. "Everything okay here?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of authority. Marcus glanced at Brad, whose face had gone pale, his hand now completely away from his gun. The sight of another FBI agent had finally broken through Brad's wall of defiance. "Yeah," Marcus said quietly, though his eyes never left Brad. "Everything's fine now." Agent Carter stood between Marcus and Brad, his presence immediately altering the atmosphere. Brad's bravado had started to falter, and though his hand no longer hovered near his weapon, Marcus could see that the internal battle was far from over. Brad was on edge, teetering between his instincts to assert control and the realization that things were spiraling beyond his grasp. Carter, calm and authoritative, turned to Brad, his eyes scanning the officer from head to toe, sizing him up. "Officer Thompson, I suggest we de-escalate the situation. Marcus here is one of us," he said, his voice firm but not aggressive. "He's been working on a high-profile case, and I don't think you want to be standing in the way of that." Brad blinked, the reality of the situation starting to settle in. His gaze flicked from Carter back to Marcus, confusion mixed with anger swirling in his eyes. The weight of Carter's words landed hard, but Brad wasn't ready to give up his sense of power just yet. "I don't know what's going on here," Brad muttered, his voice now tinged with defensiveness. "I was just doing my job." Carter nodded, his expression neutral, but his eyes sharpened as he stepped a little closer to Brad. "I'm sure you were, officer," he replied, "but things are different now. Marcus is on an official investigation, and if you keep pushing this, it's going to be a problem for you." Brad's face tightened, his hands clenching into fists by his sides. The rage was still simmering beneath the surface, but he was starting to realize the gravity of what was happening. Carter wasn't just any officer. He was FBI, and Brad knew that this was a level of authority he couldn't challenge without consequences. "I don't know who you think you are," Brad spat, though the venom in his voice had lost some of its bite. "You FBI guys come in here thinking you can do whatever you want, like the rules don't apply to you." Carter raised an eyebrow, unfazed. "The rules apply to everyone, Officer Thompson. That's exactly why Marcus is here. There's been corruption in this department, and we're here to clean it up." The words hit Brad hard, and Marcus could see the walls crumbling. Brad's face flushed with anger, but now there was something else in his expression. Fear. Marcus could tell that Brad wasn't just another bigoted officer. He was involved somehow in the very corruption Marcus had been investigating. Brad opened his mouth to speak, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. He was losing his grip on the situation, and the realization of his vulnerability was written all over his face. The man who had started this encounter full of bravado and authority was now visibly shaken. Carter pressed on, his voice low but firm. "We don't want any trouble, Officer Thompson. But if you've been involved in anything that we're looking into, now is the time to come clean." Brad's breath hitched, and Marcus saw the panic flash across his face. The tension in the air was thick as the weight of Carter's words sank in. For a moment, it looked like Brad might crack, like he might finally admit to something. But then Brad's face twisted into a sneer. "You think you can scare me into confessing?" he growled, though the fear in his voice was unmistakable. "You've got nothing on me." Carter remained calm, though Marcus could feel the shift in the situation. Brad was cornered, and he was starting to lash out in desperation. "Officer," Carter said quietly, "this isn't a game. If you're involved in any of this, you need to understand that the consequences will be severe." Marcus watched Brad closely, seeing the internal conflict raging within him. The officer was grappling with the weight of his decisions, torn between his loyalty to the corrupt system he was a part of and the fear of what might happen if he stayed silent. "You don't know anything about me," Brad muttered, his voice barely audible. He looked down at the ground, his fists still clenched tightly at his sides. Marcus took a step forward, his voice calm but steady. "I know more than you think, Brad," he said, using the officer's first name for the first time. "You've been protecting people in this department, covering up for their crimes. You might not have been at the center of it, but you're involved. And if you don't cooperate, it's going to catch up with you." Brad looked up, his eyes wide with surprise. For the first time, he seemed genuinely shaken. His bravado was gone, replaced by a growing sense of dread. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, but the words lacked conviction. Carter exchanged a glance with Marcus, sensing that they were close to breaking through. "Listen, officer," Carter said, his voice softer now. "We're not here to ruin your life, but you need to understand that this corruption runs deep, and we're taking it down. If you want to be on the right side of this, you need to start talking." Brad stood there, his face pale and his body tense, as if he was trapped in a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. Marcus could see the fear in his eyes, the realization that everything he had built his career on was crumbling around him. But then, just as it seemed Brad might finally break, the sound of approaching vehicles broke the silence. More police cars, their lights flashing, were speeding toward them. Marcus's stomach dropped. This was about to get even more complicated. Carter turned toward the approaching cars, his eyes narrowing. "We need to wrap this up, Marcus," he said under his breath. "This is going to get messy if we're not careful." Marcus nodded, his eyes flicking back to Brad. The officer looked like he was on the verge of collapse, his hands trembling at his sides. The sight of the incoming police backup was clearly overwhelming him, and Marcus knew that if they didn't act fast, they would lose any chance of getting Brad to cooperate. "Brad," Marcus said firmly, his voice cutting through the noise of the approaching cars. "This is it. You either help us now, or you go down with the rest of them." The flashing lights drew closer, and Marcus could see the panic in Brad's eyes. The officer was out of time, out of options. His lips quivered as he stared at Marcus, as if trying to make a decision that he wasn't ready to face. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Brad nodded, barely, but enough to show that he was ready to talk. I'll tell you what I know," he whispered, his voice cracking with fear. Carter stepped closer, his voice low and urgent. "Good, but we need to get out of here now." Marcus moved quickly, pulling Brad toward his car as the other police cars approached. They had no time to waste. Carter's plan was already in motion, and Marcus knew that if they stayed any longer, the situation could spiral out of control. As they reached the car, the first of the backup officers pulled up beside them. Marcus recognized the faces, officers who were likely part of the very corruption he had been investigating. He shot a glance at Carter, who nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. Brad, visibly shaken, climbed into the back seat of the car. His fear was palpable now, and Marcus could tell that the weight of his decision was starting to crush him. But there was no turning back now. As Carter got into the driver's seat, Marcus turned to look at the approaching officers. Their eyes were hard, suspicious. One of them, a tall, heavy-set man, stepped out of his car, his hand resting on his gun. "You boys need any help here?" the officer asked, his voice thick with suspicion. Marcus shook his head, keeping his face neutral. "We're good. Just wrapping things up." The officer's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. Carter started the car, and without another word they drove off, leaving the flashing lights and the tension of the roadside encounter behind them. As they sped away, Marcus glanced at Brad in the rearview mirror. The officer looked like a man who had just seen his world fall apart, his face pale and his eyes distant. "You did the right thing," Marcus said quietly, though he knew that Brad wasn't ready to hear it yet. The road ahead was long, and the battle was far from over. But for the first time, Marcus felt like they had a chance, a real chance, to expose the corruption that had poisoned the department for so long. And with Brad's help, they might just be able to bring it all down. The ride away from the confrontation was tense, the air inside the car heavy with the weight of everything that had just unfolded. Brad sat in the back seat, his hands clasped tightly together as if trying to hold himself steady. He stared blankly out the window, his mind clearly racing. Marcus could feel the strain radiating off of him, the full reality of his situation sinking in. This was a man whose world had just shattered, and Marcus knew the next steps would be critical. Agent Carter drove with a steady hand, his eyes occasionally flicking up to the rearview mirror to check on Brad. The silence was thick, punctuated only by the hum of the engine and the distant sound of sirens fading into the night behind them. "We need to get somewhere safe to talk," Carter finally said, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but there was an urgency beneath the surface. "Somewhere we won't be interrupted." Brad didn't respond, still staring out the window, his face pale and his body rigid. Marcus turned in his seat to face him, speaking in a measured tone. "Brad, I know this is a lot to take in, but we're going to need your help if we're going to take these guys down. You're the key to making sure this stops." Brad's eyes flicked toward Marcus, his expression unreadable. He was clearly torn between fear and anger, his thoughts swirling in a chaotic mix. "You don't understand," he muttered, his voice low and shaky. "These people, they won't just let this go. They'll come after me. After my family." Marcus nodded, understanding the gravity of Brad's fear. He had dealt with officers like Brad before, men who were caught in a system they knew was broken but felt powerless to escape. This wasn't just about protecting his job anymore. Brad was facing the potential collapse of his entire life. "I know it's scary," Marcus said softly, trying to reach Brad through the fog of fear. "But if you help us, we can protect you. We can make sure this stops here and that you and your family are safe." Brad shook his head, his eyes wide with panic. "You don't know these people," he said, his voice trembling. "They've been doing this for years. They're not just going to walk away because you show up with some badge." Marcus glanced at Carter, who gave a small nod. They both knew Brad was right. This wasn't going to be easy, but they had to push forward. They had come too far to back down now. "We're not asking you to take them on alone," Carter said, his voice firm. "We're building a case, and we need your testimony to seal it. Without you, it's going to be a lot harder to take them down. But with you, we can bring them all to justice." The car slowed as Carter pulled into the parking lot of an old warehouse, its rusted metal exterior standing as a stark reminder of the industrial decay of the area. It was isolated, away from prying eyes, and for now, it was safe. Carter turned off the engine and looked back at Brad. "You're not alone in this," he said, his tone softening. "But you have to decide if you're ready to do the right thing." Brad sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. His entire life had been built around loyalty to his fellow officers, to the badge, to the system. But now that very system had turned against him, and he was being asked to betray everything he thought he stood for. Marcus opened his door and stepped out of the car, gesturing for Brad to follow. "Let's go inside and talk," he said. "We can figure out the next steps together." Brad hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting between Marcus and Carter, before finally unbuckling his seatbelt and stepping out of the car. He looked around, as if expecting someone to jump out of the shadows, but the warehouse lot was deserted. The only sounds were the distant chirping of insects and the faint rustle of the wind through the trees. They made their way toward the entrance of the warehouse, the old metal door creaking as Carter pushed it open. Inside, the space was dimly lit by a few overhead lights, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. The air was cool and musty, the remnants of an abandoned industrial site long forgotten by the city. Marcus led Brad to a table near the center of the room and gestured for him to sit. Brad sank into the chair, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of the entire world had just settled on them. He ran a hand through his hair, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "We're safe here," Marcus reassured him, sitting down across from him. "No one's going to find us. This is just between us." Carter remained standing, his arms crossed, watching the two men with a keen eye. He had seen situations like this before. Good men caught up in bad circumstances, unsure of how to move forward. But Brad was different. He wasn't just a bystander. He had been complicit in the system for years, and now he was facing the consequences. Brad exhaled shakily, his hands trembling slightly as he rubbed them together. "You don't get it," he whispered, his voice cracking. I thought I was doing the right thing. You know, keeping order, protecting people." Marcus leaned forward, his eyes locked on Brad's. "But deep down you knew something was wrong, didn't you?" he asked gently. "You saw things that didn't add up. You knew the system wasn't working the way it was supposed to." Brad's face tightened, his jaw clenched as he stared down at the table. The truth was too painful to admit, but it was there, looming over him like a dark cloud. I didn't know how deep it went," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just thought maybe it was a few bad apples." Marcus nodded, recognizing the all-too-familiar justification. "It's never just a few bad apples, Brad," he said quietly. "It's a system that protects them, that lets them get away with it, and you know that." Brad's eyes flicked up to meet Marcus's, and for the first time, there was a flicker of understanding there, an acknowledgement of the truth he had been trying so hard to avoid. "What do you need from me?" Brad asked, his voice hollow, as if the fight had finally drained out of him. Carter stepped forward, his tone calm but firm. "We need names, details, everything you know about the officers involved. You give us that, and we can protect you." Brad swallowed hard, his face pale as the enormity of what he was about to do settled in. This wasn't just about giving up a few names. This was about dismantling everything he had built his life around. But as he sat there, staring at Marcus and Carter, he realized that there was no going back. He had made his choice, and now he had to live with it. "Okay," Brad whispered, his voice trembling. "I'll tell you everything." Brad's confession began slowly, his words coming out in halting, broken sentences. It was clear that he was still grappling with the gravity of what he was about to do. But as Marcus and Carter listened in silence, Brad began to let go of the fear and shame that had held him back. "They've been doing it for years," Brad finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. He looked down at his hands, unable to meet their eyes as the weight of the truth settled on his shoulders. Planting evidence, fabricating reports, all of it. They wanted quick convictions, and anyone who got in the way, they took care of. Marcus exchanged a glance with Carter, both men realizing just how deep the corruption ran. This wasn't just a few officers bending the rules. This was a full-scale operation, protected by a culture of silence and fear. "Who's leading it?" Carter asked, his voice calm but direct. "We need names, Brad. We need to know who's behind this." Brad swallowed hard, his face pale. "It's not just one person," he muttered. "It's a group. Sergeant Collins is the one who handles most of the dirty work, but it goes higher than that. Detective Ramirez, he's the one pulling the strings. He's got connections all the way up the chain. I don't even know how far it goes." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. Ramirez had been on his radar for months, but this confirmation from Brad connected all the dots. Marcus had suspected Ramirez of being deeply involved, but hearing it from Brad made it real. Ramirez wasn't just another corrupt officer, he was the linchpin of the entire operation. "They've been taking bribes from local businesses, keeping the streets clean by locking up anyone who causes trouble, whether they're guilty or not," Brad continued, his voice shaky. "It's all about maintaining power, keeping the right people happy. If you don't play along, you're out." Marcus leaned in, his eyes sharp, absorbing every detail. "How long have you known about this?" he asked. Brad hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "I started noticing things a few years ago. At first, I didn't ask questions. Everyone was doing it, and I figured it wasn't my business. You don't rise through the ranks by questioning your superiors." Marcus sighed. This was the reality he had seen play out time and time again. Good officers being sucked into a corrupt system because silence was easier than standing up. It didn't surprise him, but it still stung to hear it from Brad, someone who now seemed so aware of the damage his silence had caused. Carter pulled up a chair next to Brad, his tone shifting to one of urgency. "Brad, listen to me. We have enough to start building a case, but your testimony is crucial. You need to tell us everything, down to the last detail. We're going to take this all the way up, but we need you to be all in." Brad looked up, his face filled with uncertainty. "And then what? I go back to the station, pretend like none of this happened? These guys, they'll know I talked. They'll come after me. My family. We'll make sure you're protected," Marcus said, his voice steady. "But you need to decide now. Are you ready to stand up and do the right thing?" The room fell into a heavy silence as Brad wrestled with his decision. He knew what was at stake. The people he had worked alongside, the men he had once called brothers, were now his enemies. If he spoke out, he would be risking everything. But Marcus could see the shift happening inside Brad. The weight of his actions, the years of looking the other way, were bearing down on him. There was no easy way out of this, but for the first time, Brad seemed to realize that staying silent would destroy him just as much as speaking out. After what felt like an eternity, Brad exhaled slowly, nodding. "I'll do it," he whispered, his voice full of resignation. "I'll tell you everything. Ramirez, Collins, everyone involved." Marcus felt a wave of relief wash over him. This was it, the break they had been waiting for. With Brad's testimony, they could finally bring down the corrupt officers who had been running the department like a criminal enterprise. But just as Marcus opened his mouth to respond, The sound of screeching tires echoed through the warehouse. Carter and Marcus exchanged a glance before they both shot to their feet, adrenaline surging through their bodies. Brad froze, his face draining of color. "They've found us," Brad muttered, his voice barely audible. Carter quickly moved to the nearest window, peering outside. Sure enough, several unmarked cars had pulled up to the warehouse, their headlights cutting through the darkness like searchlights. Ramirez's men. "We need to move. Now," Carter said urgently, turning to Marcus and Brad. "We can't stay here. They're not here to negotiate." Marcus nodded, grabbing Brad by the arm. "Come on, we're getting out of here." Brad's fear was palpable as he stumbled to his feet, his eyes wide with panic. "What if they get inside? We can't outrun them." Marcus's voice was firm, steadying. "You just need to trust us. We'll get you out." They moved quickly toward the back exit of the warehouse, the sound of footsteps and muffled voices growing louder as the officers closed in. Marcus's mind raced as he formulated a plan. There was no way they could go out the front without running straight into the ambush. They needed to find a way out before Ramirez's men realized they were trying to escape. Carter led them through a narrow hallway, the echoes of their footsteps bouncing off the concrete walls. The tension was suffocating, every second feeling like it could be their last before being discovered. Just as they reached the back door, the sound of the warehouse door being kicked open filled the air. Ramirez's men had entered the building. Marcus glanced back at Brad, who was visibly shaking. "Stay close," he whispered. "We're almost out." Carter pushed open the back door, and the cool night air hit them like a wave of relief. They slipped outside, moving quickly toward Carter's car, which was parked in the shadows of the alley behind the warehouse. Just as they reached the car, the back door of the warehouse swung open behind them. Two officers stepped out, their eyes locking onto the fleeing group. "There!" one of them shouted, drawing his weapon. Carter and Marcus shoved Brad into the back seat, moving with lightning speed. "Go," Carter barked as he jumped into the driver's seat, slamming the car into gear. The tires squealed as they sped out of the alley, bullets whizzing past the car as Ramirez's men opened fire. The sound of gunfire echoed through the night, but Carter didn't slow down. He kept the pedal to the floor, weaving through the narrow streets as they made their escape. Marcus turned in his seat to check on Brad, who was hunched over, his face pale with fear. "We're going to get through this," Marcus said firmly, though his heart was still pounding in his chest. "Just hang on." Brad nodded weakly, too terrified to speak. His life had just changed forever, and Marcus knew that no matter how this played out, Brad would never be the same. They drove for what felt like hours, winding through back streets and alleys until they were sure they had lost Ramirez's men. Finally, Carter pulled the car into a secure garage, the adrenaline still coursing through all of them as they stepped out into the quiet space. For a moment, no one spoke. The tension hung in the air, the reality of what had just happened settling in. Marcus looked over at Brad, who was sitting on the curb, his head in his hands. "You did the right thing," Marcus said softly, walking over to him. "I know it's hard, but you're going to be okay. We're going to bring them down, all of them." Brad didn't respond right away, his body trembling with the weight of everything that had just happened. Finally, he looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and regret. "I just want this to be over," Brad whispered, his voice barely audible. "I don't want to live like this anymore." Marcus nodded, understanding the depth of Brad's pain. "It will be over soon. We're almost there." Carter joined them, his face grim but determined. "We've got enough to move forward, but we need to keep you safe, Brad. We'll get you into protective custody until we can take Ramirez and his crew down." Brad nodded slowly, his eyes filled with resignation. He knew there was no turning back now. As they prepared to move to the next safe location, Marcus couldn't help but feel the weight of the task ahead. Taking down Ramirez and the corrupt officers wasn't going to be easy, but with Brad's testimony, they finally had a chance. And for the first time in a long while, Marcus felt a flicker of hope.